The scream cut through the air like a blade. One moment, the Westgate Premier Shopping Center was humming along the way. It always did on a Saturday afternoon. The low roar of 1,000 conversations, the shuffle of shopping bags, the synthetic perfume of department stores, blending into something vaguely floral and synthetic. Then, 3 security guards in matching Navy uniforms broke into a sprint, crossed the atrium at full speed, and slammed into a woman standing near the entrance of a luxury accessories boutique. She went down hard. Her shopping bags skidded across the polished marble floor, and within seconds, the phones went up, dozens of them recording every moment as the guards wrestled her arms behind her back and reached for the zip ties on their belts. The crowd that gathered did not rush to help. They stood at a comfortable distance, murmuring to one another, already drawing conclusions. She was a black woman. She was on the ground. The guards were pressing their weight into her. And in the minds of far too many people standing there that afternoon, that was enough to understand what had happened. Except it wasn't. Because what happened next, what unfolded in the span of fewer than 8 seconds, would leave every single person in that building questioning everything they thought they knew. What those guards did not know, what the crowd filming on their phones did not know, what no one in that mall on that particular Saturday had any reason to suspect, was that the woman pinned beneath them had spent more than a decade training to be exactly where she was. Only she had always been taught that the measure of true strength was not how much damage you could do, but how much damage you chose not to. Her name was Sergeant First Class Renee Carter, though she hadn't used that title in almost 3 years. Not since she separated from the United States Army, after 11 years, 4 overseas deployments, and a distinguished record that most people who saw her walking through a mall on a Saturday afternoon would never have guessed at. Renee was 34 years old. She stood 5 feet 8, with a lean, composed build and the kind of posture that comes not from vanity, but from years of physical discipline. She wore her natural hair close-cropped, a habit carried over from service, and dressed simply dark jeans, a fitted olive jacket, clean white sneakers. She moved through the world the way soldiers often do after they leave, quietly, efficiently, always aware of the exits, always scanning the room without appearing to, always 2 steps ahead of whatever was happening around her. She had learned, in the years since leaving the Army, that being a black woman in certain spaces meant that a kind of visibility was imposed on her, whether she wanted it or not, so she had developed the art of being unremarkable. She did not argue unnecessarily. She did not raise her voice. She said please and thank you. She kept her receipts. She had been doing all of this for so long that it had become second nature, as automatic as the combat techniques she had trained into muscle memory over the better part of a decade. She had grown up in Columbus, Ohio, the second of 3 daughters, in a household where her mother worked double shifts at a hospital and her father ran a small electrical contracting business out of a pickup truck and a cell phone. It was not a life of excess, but it was not a life of deprivation either. It was the particular kind of American upbringing built on the understanding that what you got, you earned, and that the way you behaved when things were hard said more about you than anything else. Renee had joined the Army at 22, following a college roommate who had described the experience with a directness that appealed to something already forming in Renee's character, the desire for structure, for purpose, for a framework where effort and result were in clear relationship with each other. She had not expected to love it as much as she did. She had not expected to be as good at it as she turned out to be. But the Army, and specifically the Combatives program, gave her something that nothing else had quite offered, a complete discipline, one that demanded equal parts physical precision and psychological control, and that treated the ability to hold yourself back as the highest expression of what you were capable of doing. When she separated after 11 years, it had been the right decision. Her body had asked for it, and her life outside the uniform had been waiting, but she carried the training with her. The way you carry something that has become so integrated into how you move and think and respond that there is no meaningful distinction between the skill and the self. That Saturday, Renee had come to Westgate with a short list of goals and a 2-hour window before she needed to be across town. She was buying a birthday gift for her mother, something meaningful, something that her mother would not buy for herself. She had also promised herself that she would finally replace the old watch she had worn into the ground during her last deployment, a scratched-up field watch she'd bought at a military surplus store in 2014, and which had kept perfect time through 2 Middle Eastern summers and 1 hard winter in Eastern Europe. And she needed to look presentable. A reunion dinner with former unit members was coming up the following weekend, the kind of dinner that reminded her, always, of the people she had served beside and the version of herself she had been when she wore the uniform. She was looking forward to it in the way you look forward to something that is equal parts comfortable and complicated. She had not been back to this particular mall in several months. She found large retail spaces overstimulating in a way she would never quite articulate to anyone who hadn't spent time in combat zones, where hyper-awareness wasn't a personality quirk, but a survival mechanism, and where transitioning out of that mode took years, sometimes a lifetime. But she had a list. She had a plan. She moved through the main corridor with purposeful calm, the kind of woman who does not browse so much as execute. The boutique she entered was called Alara, a high-end accessories shop anchored between a perfumery and a leather goods store in the mall's premium wing. It carried handbags starting at $400, scarves imported from Lyon, and a rotating case of fine jewelry near the back that was kept under soft halogen lighting and guarded by a small magnetic lock. Renee was not there for any of that. She was looking at a silk scarf for her mother, something in deep burgundy, her mother's color, the kind of thing her mother would fold and refold and eventually hang in the closet because it was too beautiful to wear. She found one near the back wall, checked the price, winced slightly, and decided to buy it anyway. Around her, the store moved at the pace of affluence, slow, deliberate, the kind of shopping that implies you have enough time and enough money that neither one concerns you. A saleswoman with sharp cheekbones and a practiced smile drifted near Renee without quite approaching her, maintaining a distance that was professionally ambiguous, close enough to assist, close enough to observe. Renee noticed. She always noticed. She said nothing. 2 displays away, a woman in a cream-colored blazer and high-heeled boots was browsing the jewelry case. She was the kind of woman who occupied space with absolute confidence. Large shopping bag from another boutique swinging from her wrist, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in the clipped, distracted tone of someone accustomed to being heard. Her name, as it would later be established, was Margaret Holloway. Margaret was 47, a partner at a commercial real estate firm, and she had spent the afternoon buying things for a vacation she was planning for the following month. She was looking at a diamond tennis bracelet not to purchase, just to consider, and when the saleswoman behind the case lifted it out for her to examine, Margaret leaned forward, shifted her shopping bag, and the bracelet slipped from her fingers. It fell in a small, silent arc and landed, by the particular indifference of physics, directly inside the open top of Renee's shopping basket, which was sitting on the floor beside her as she examined the scarf. Neither woman saw it happen. The saleswoman behind the case had looked down at the same moment. Margaret muttered something into her phone and walked away from the display case. And Renee, holding the burgundy scarf up to the light to check the color, had no idea that $12,000 worth of diamonds were now resting among her purchases. The alarm sounded exactly 47 seconds later. When Renee approached the register with the scarf, the store's anti-theft sensor, detecting the active security tag, still attached to the bracelet inside her basket. It was not a subtle alarm. It was the kind designed to be heard throughout a store, a sharp, repeating tone that silenced every conversation and turned every head. Renee stopped walking. She looked down at her basket, genuinely puzzled. The saleswoman with sharp cheekbones was no longer pretending to browse nearby. She was already picking up the phone on the register. The woman at the register looked at Renee with an expression that was not quite accusation, but was definitely not neutrality. And from the back room, where the store's 2-way mirrors overlooked the floor, a man in a Navy security uniform was already speaking into his radio, his voice low and precise, delivering the information that would set the next 20 minutes into motion. "We have a suspected theft. Female, black, 30s, near the front register. Do not let her leave the store. There were 4 of them when they arrived. Not the 3 that would later be described in most accounts of the day, but 2 from Westgate's permanent security team, 1 contract guard from an outside firm, and the team's shift leader, a broad-shouldered man named Davis, who had spent 6 years in private security after washing out of a police academy, and who carried himself with the particular authority of someone who believed that certainty and accuracy were the same thing. They formed a loose semicircle at the boutique's entrance, cutting off the natural path to the door. Davis stepped forward and spoke in the practiced, flat tone of someone who has delivered this script before. They needed to check her bag. There had been an alarm. It was standard procedure. Renee looked at him for a moment. She looked at the other 3. She looked at the small crowd already forming on the other side of the glass. Then she nodded, set her basket on the counter, and said, "Of course." She stepped back, kept her hands visible, and waited. It was the kind of cooperation that came from discipline, rather than fear, the careful, deliberate behavior of someone who understood exactly what situation she was in and was determined to handle it correctly, because she knew that in situations like this one, how you behaved in the first 30 seconds shaped everything that came after. Davis found the bracelet in under 10 seconds. He lifted it from the basket by the security tag, held it up, and turned to look at Renee with an expression that had moved well past neutral into something that felt, to the people watching through the glass, like triumph. Renee looked at the bracelet with the same expression she might have worn, looking at something that had appeared in her bag by magic, which, from her perspective, it essentially had. She said, quietly and clearly, that she didn't know how that had gotten there. She had not touched the jewelry display. She had been looking at the scarves. She would be happy to look at the security footage with them. Davis was not interested in the security footage. He was interested in wrapping this up. The guards spread out slightly, taking positions that were textbook detention formation, and Davis told Renee that they were going to need to hold her until police arrived. Renee said she understood. She kept her hands in plain sight. But the crowd outside the glass had been watching, and as often happens in public spaces where something charged and visible is unfolding, the observers had begun to narrate to one another, filling in the gaps in what they could see with what they already believed. A woman near the entrance shifted her shopping bag and said, loud enough for several people around her to hear, "You can always tell, can't you?" The man beside her laughed, a short, dismissive sound. A teenager pointed his phone directly at Renee's face through the glass. Someone outside said something that was not quite intelligible through the boutique's doors, but whose tone was unmistakable, the specific register of mockery layered on top of contempt. Inside the store, the saleswoman was speaking in a low, rapid voice to someone on her phone, occasionally glancing at Renee with the expression of someone who has already decided how this story ends. Renee heard all of it. She stood very still and heard every word, every laugh, every implication, and she kept her hands visible and her face calm, because she had learned in places far more dangerous than this that composure was not the absence of feeling, but the discipline to act correctly regardless of it. Then one of the contract guards stepped behind her and reached for her wrist without warning or instruction, attempting to apply a restraining hold before police had arrived, before any formal process had been followed, before anyone had asked Renee to move or indicated that she had failed to cooperate. His hands were large, and his grip was sudden. He torqued her arm toward her back with the quick, practiced motion of someone who had done this before, and in that moment, something engaged in Renee Carter that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the 11 years of training that lived in her body at a level beneath conscious thought. The shift leader stepped in from the other side, reaching for her shoulder with one hand and pressing down on the back of her neck with the other, a technique that was, by any objective standard, excessive force applied to a cooperating individual. A third guard moved in to assist, grabbing for her free arm. "I am not resisting," Renee said. Her voice was completely level. "I am not resisting." She said it twice, not because she expected it to stop them, but because she needed it on record. And then, because she had no alternative, and because the force being applied to her joints was approaching the threshold where compliance would mean injury, she moved. What she did in the next 7 seconds was not a fight. It was a demonstration of the principle that had governed her entire approach to combat since she first walked into Army Combatives training more than a decade earlier. Control the space, neutralize the threat, cause the minimum damage necessary to achieve that objective, and not 1 ounce more. The guard at her wrist felt his grip dissolve without quite understanding how one moment he had her, and the next his arm was moving in a direction that caused him to lose his footing and sit down heavily on the polished floor. The shift leader at her neck found himself rotating in a motion that took him off balance before he could apply any additional pressure, and the weight he'd intended to put on her became the thing that put him on one knee. The third guard reached forward and found nothing there. Or rather, he found Renee's hand on his extended forearm, and then found himself redirected sideways with a force that was precisely calibrated, enough to take him out of the equation without causing injury. He stumbled, caught himself on a display table, and stayed there, more confused than hurt. The whole sequence took fewer than 8 seconds. When it was over, Renee was standing in the middle of the boutique in the same composed posture she had maintained throughout the entire encounter. Her hands were at her sides. Her breathing was measured. All 3 guards were on the floor or braced against furniture. None of them were seriously injured. The store was absolutely silent. For a moment, no one moved. The crowd outside the glass had stopped narrating. A woman who had been saying something into her phone trailed off mid-sentence. The shift leader, from his position on one knee, stared at Renee with an expression that had entirely lost its certainty. Then he got up, stepped back, and reached for his radio. "We need police here now," he said. She attacked security. The words came out clipped and automated, the script reasserting itself. The narrative that had already been decided, scrambling to incorporate what had just happened. "She attacked us." Renee said nothing. She stood in the center of the room and waited. The 2 officers who responded were named Garza and Webb. Garza was the senior officer, 16 years on the force, a deliberate man who arrived at scenes with his hands loose and his conclusions provisional. Webb was younger, 5 years in, and had the attentive quality of someone still learning how to read what was in front of him, rather than what he expected to find. They came through the boutique entrance quickly, assessed the room, and listened first to Davis, who explained in a rushed, confident voice that the woman he pointed at Renee had resisted detention, had assaulted 3 members of the security team, and had been caught with stolen merchandise. Renee listened to this without interrupting. When Garza turned to her, she said simply, "I didn't steal anything. I was cooperating. They applied force without cause, and I protected myself. I'm prepared to be fully cooperative." Garza looked at the 3 guards, 2 of them visibly nursing their dignity, one still leaning against the display table. He looked at Renee's posture. He looked at her hands, which she had raised to shoulder height the moment he turned toward her, a gesture that was automatic and unmistakably trained. Webb stepped slightly to the right, taking in her stance, the way she tracked both officers simultaneously, without appearing to. The particular kind of calm that wasn't civilian calm at all. He said nothing yet. He was forming a question. "We need to get the cuffs on her," Davis said. Garza told Davis they would handle it. He asked Renee to turn around and place her hands behind her back. She said, "Of course," and did exactly that, making the deliberate, slow movements of someone who intends every gesture to be unambiguous. As Garza applied the handcuffs loosely, professionally, Webb watched. He had seen that posture before. That way of standing, that way of distributing weight, that calibrated economy of motion. He had done 4 years in the Marine Corps before joining the police force, and he recognized in Renee Carter a kind of physical authority that did not come from a gym or from street fighting, but from somewhere much more systematic. He waited until Garza had stepped aside to speak to Davis before he moved close to Renee and said it quietly enough that it didn't carry across the room. "Did you serve?" She turned her head just enough to be facing him. "Army," she said. 11 years. I got out 3 years ago." Webb nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a notepad that he didn't open. "What's your background?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone deciding how much is relevant. "Combatives," she said. "Level 4 certification. Instructor. I ran the program for my unit for the last 4 years I was in. Webb put the notepad back, without writing anything down. He walked back to where Garza was standing, leaned in, and spoke in a low voice that Davis had to strain to hear. "We need to pull the camera footage before we do anything else." The Westgate security control room was a dim, climate-controlled space on the building's second level, accessed through a door marked Authorized Personnel that was located near the service corridor behind the food court. The room had 12 monitors, 3 of which covered the premium wing where Alara was located, and the footage it held was continuous, unedited, and time-stamped. The mall's head of security, a compact, gray-haired woman named Patricia Sims, who had been with Westgate for 14 years, pulled up the relevant segment in under 2 minutes. The footage was high definition, and the camera angle on Alara's interior was broad enough to capture nearly the entire sales floor. What it showed was unambiguous. Margaret Holloway at the jewelry counter, the bracelet dropping in its small, silent arc, landing in Renee's basket, Renee unaware and examining a scarf several feet away. What it showed next was also unambiguous. Renee at the register, the alarm sounding, the guards arriving, Renee complying without hesitation, setting down her bag, stepping back, keeping her hands in view. Then the guard reaching for her wrist without instruction. Then the neck hold. Then 3 guards applying force to a woman who had said clearly and on record that she was not resisting. Patricia Sims watched the footage twice. Then she picked up her radio and contacted the mall's general manager. Her voice was flat and careful, in the way of someone who has just understood the full scope of a serious problem. "We need management down here," she said. "We have a significant situation with the Alara incident." She did not elaborate on what she meant by significant. She didn't need to. The footage would do that on its own. Within 6 minutes, the footage was playing on a second monitor that had been configured to display on the screen mounted in the main atrium corridor. A decision made initially in haste, in an attempt to show witnesses what had happened before any further confusion set in, and which had the unintended consequence of showing approximately 300 shoppers, in real time, exactly what the cameras had captured. The atrium went quiet, not the polite quiet of a moment of shared observation, but the specific silence that falls when a group of people who have drawn a collective conclusion discover, simultaneously, that they were wrong. The woman who had said you could always tell watched herself being wrong in high definition, on a screen 6 feet wide. The man who had laughed stood with his shopping bags and had nothing to say. The teenager with the phone, who had been narrating the whole incident live for the better part of 20 minutes, let the phone drop to his side and stopped talking. The sales assistant from Alara, who had been telling someone on her phone what she'd witnessed, went quiet mid-sentence. People did not move. They watched the footage, the bracelet falling, Renee unaware, the guards forcing her down, and the story they had been telling themselves dissolved under the weight of what was actually there. What the footage made inescapably visible was the gap between assumption and fact, laid out in time-stamped high definition for anyone willing to look honestly at what was there. It showed a woman who had done everything right. Everything. She had set her bag down voluntarily. She had kept her hands in clear view. She had not argued or moved toward the door or made any gesture that could be reasonably interpreted as threatening. She had said, on camera, with audio that Patricia Sims later confirmed was fully audible in the recording, that she was not resisting. And then 3 men had applied force to her anyway, because the story they were already telling about her was louder than the evidence in front of them. That was the part that settled over the atrium crowd, with the particular weight of a truth that is uncomfortable precisely because it is not unfamiliar. Most of the people watching had told similar stories at some point about someone they didn't know. In some space they shared briefly, based on nothing more than what a person looked like and what that appearance triggered in a set of assumptions they had never quite examined. The screen showed them what those assumptions cost. It cost this particular woman 7 minutes of wrongful force and a humiliation she had done nothing to earn. In other circumstances, in other cities, with other people, the cost had been and continued to be something far worse. The atrium was quiet, with the sound of people thinking things they wouldn't quite say out loud. Outside the boutique doors, where Renee was still standing with Officer Garza while Webb went to retrieve the footage confirmation. A small group that had been pressing close to the glass began to step back, slowly, and without drawing attention to it, the way people do when they want to physically distance themselves from the position they have just been standing in. And then Officer Webb returned, and with him came the footage review that changed everything. He played the relevant segment on a tablet for Officer Garza, and Garza watched it once, then looked at Davis with an expression that was not anger, but was something in the neighborhood of disappointment. He said, "The footage is not consistent with what you've described." Davis watched the tablet screen and said nothing. The guard who had first applied force, the one who had grabbed Renee's wrist without cause, had developed an intense interest in the floor, somewhere near his left boot. The third guard, still leaning against the display table, had gone from stunned to quietly alarmed in the way of someone working out, in real time, what the last 20 minutes are going to mean for his employment status. Patricia Sims, who had come down from the control room herself, was already on the phone with Westgate's legal department. She knew exactly what the footage showed, and she knew exactly what it meant. Garza removed the handcuffs from Renee's wrists. He did it without ceremony, and when it was done, he turned to face her directly and said, with the specific, formal care of someone choosing words that will matter later, "I apologize for the inconvenience. Ma'am, you are not being detained. Based on the footage, no laws were broken on your part. We are opening an investigation into the use of force." Renee rubbed her wrists briefly, not from pain, but from the muscle memory of the motion. She said thank you. She picked up her shopping basket, which someone had set on the counter during the confusion. She stood in the middle of the boutique and waited. She was not quite ready to leave yet. There was something that needed to happen first, and she could feel it gathering in the room around her. It was Garza who recognized her name. He had been scrolling through his own memory since Webb first mentioned Combatives, and something about the way Patricia Sims had pulled up the footage and the way the guards had landed had unlocked it. The name Renee Carter, a news story from several years earlier, a photograph in an Army press release. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "Sergeant Carter, the girl from the Combatives Championships." She met his eyes. "That was a while ago," she said. He shook his head slowly. "Not that long." He turned to say something to Webb, and Webb was already looking it up on his phone, and within 2 minutes, information began spreading through the boutique and then through the atrium, in the particular accelerated way that information moves through a crowd when people have been wrong about something and are working to understand how badly. Her service record was not classified. Her competition record was a matter of public documentation. The Army press releases were still indexed and searchable, including the one from 8 years prior, with a photograph of Renee in dress uniform, accepting an award at a ceremony where her Combatives championship was recognized alongside commendations for actions during her second deployment. Actions that had, according to the official language, saved the lives of 2 fellow soldiers and resulted in her own injury, which she had not reported until the mission was complete. There were photographs from the tournament circuit. There was a profile piece from a military publication that described her as one of the most technically precise fighters her instructors had seen come through the Combatives program. There was a photograph of her, 7 years ago, shaking hands with a general. People in the atrium were looking at their phones and then looking at the woman standing inside the boutique, and the math was not difficult. The teenager who had been filming put his phone away. 2 women who had been exchanging comments near the entrance found something elsewhere to look at. A man who had made a remark about her kind was very carefully, not making eye contact with anyone around him. And the people who had said nothing, who had stood and watched and filmed without intervening, were having a quieter, but no less significant reckoning with what their silence had meant. Margaret Holloway, who had been notified and had returned to the boutique once she heard about the alarm, initially confused, then horrified, stood near the jewelry counter and said to no one in particular, "It fell out of my bag. I didn't see it fall. Oh God, I didn't see it." A saleswoman confirmed what the footage had already shown. Margaret looked at Renee across the store with the stricken expression of someone who understands that their accident has caused damage they cannot fully measure. "I'm so sorry," she said. Renee looked at her for a moment. "It was an accident," she said. "I know that." Margaret didn't quite seem to believe that Renee could know it and still mean it, but Renee did. The guards had been moved to a separate area of the boutique by Patricia Sims, who arrived with the legal department on the phone and the footage on her tablet and a face that communicated, without ambiguity, that she was done with the version of events that had been presented over the radio. Davis sat in a chair near the storage room door, with the expression of someone watching a carefully constructed narrative collapse from the inside. The guard who had grabbed Renee's wrist without instruction was already composing, in his head, an explanation that he was not going to be able to make sound reasonable. The third guard had asked if he needed to call a union representative, and Patricia Sims had told him, not unkindly, that that was probably a good idea. The general manager of Westgate Premier Shopping Center arrived 17 minutes after the incident ended. His name was Douglas Fenn, and he was a trim, silver-haired man in his early 50s who had spent 20 years in retail management and who understood, the moment he stepped off the elevator and saw the footage playing on the atrium screen, that the next several weeks of his professional life had just become considerably more complicated. He found Renee standing near the boutique entrance with Officer Garza, and he introduced himself with the careful, formal warmth of someone trying to establish a tone of conciliation before anything else was said. He offered his deepest apologies. He told her that what had happened was unacceptable and not reflective of Westgate's values and standards. He said the word unacceptable 3 times in the first 2 minutes, which is usually a reliable indicator of how acceptable the thing had been up until the moment it became visible. He offered a formal written apology on Westgate letterhead. He offered a compensation package. He offered a substantial store credit, applicable across all Westgate retailers. He offered to have the external footage, the segment that had already been recorded by dozens of bystanders' phones and which was not in any meaningful sense containable, reviewed by Westgate's communications team, as if that were something he had any power over. Renee heard all of this. She let him finish. Then she said, clearly and without aggression, "I don't want compensation. I don't want a gift card. What I want is for you to retrain your security team in de-escalation, in implicit bias, in the correct procedures for detaining a person." She paused for a moment and then said, "What happened to me today was wrong, but the reason it will keep happening to other people is because no one is being taught how to do this correctly. That's what needs to change." Fenn blinked. He had prepared for a number of responses to his offer. This was not among them. Around them, the atrium was quiet enough that her voice carried further than she intended, and a dozen people standing near the entrance heard every word. Renee looked at Fenn steadily. "Those guards don't need to be fired," she said. "They need to be educated. There's a difference." Fenn looked at her for a long moment, and then nodded, slowly. The way people nod when they have just realized they are in a conversation that is more significant than they had prepared for. Officer Garza completed the incident report with the kind of thorough precision he applied to every document he signed his name to, because he understood that official records were the architecture of accountability. The report documented the anti-theft alarm, the security response, the application of force to a cooperating individual, Renee Carter's response to that force, and the footage review that established the factual sequence of events. It documented that no theft had occurred, that Renee had issued a clear verbal declaration of non-resistance prior to defending herself, and that the force applied by the security team had been excessive relative to the situation. 3 of the 4 guards were placed on suspension, pending a formal review by Westgate's management and the contracted security firm. Davis, the shift leader, was recommended for retraining, pending an assessment of whether his conduct met the threshold for termination. The contracted guard who had applied the first hold was flagged for immediate review with the outside firm that employed him. The report took 45 minutes to complete, and Garza signed it at 4:13 in the afternoon, 3 hours and 8 minutes after Renee Carter had first walked into the Alara boutique to buy her mother a scarf. The days that followed unfolded in the strange double tempo that significant events sometimes produce rapidly in public, and slowly, with great weight, in private. The footage from the atrium security cameras, the footage recorded on bystanders' phones, and the boutique's own interior footage were shared by Westgate's communications team in a carefully worded statement that acknowledged the incident, confirmed the investigation, and included Renee's name only with her explicit permission. She gave it. She understood that her name was already out there, had been out there for years, in a form that most people had simply never had occasion to look at, and that the story would be told more accurately with her involvement than without it. Former service members who had trained with Renee, deployed alongside her, or been through the Combatives program she had run, came forward in the days that followed with the kind of unequivocal, detailed testimony that resists reduction. They described the Renee Carter they knew technically brilliant, personally reserved, obsessively fair-minded, constitutionally incapable of losing her head when things got complicated. A colonel who had overseen her last deployment said that in more than 3 decades of service, she was among the handful of soldiers he had encountered, whose judgment he trusted without reservation. A fellow Combatives instructor said that what Renee had done in the boutique was so characteristic of how she had always trained that it was almost textbook, the minimum force, the maximum control, the deliberate restraint of capability. One former unit member, a staff sergeant named Marcus, who had deployed with Renee twice and who had been through her combative sessions in the year before she separated, told a reporter who reached him by phone that he had known immediately what the footage was showing, and that his first reaction had not been surprise but something closer to recognition. "That's exactly how she trained us," he said. "You don't use what you don't need to use, ever. The whole point of knowing how to fight is that you get to choose not to." Another veteran, a woman who had gone through the program when Renee was running it and had since left the Army and become a high school athletics coach, said that Renee was the reason she had ever taken Combatives seriously. Not because Renee made it look exciting, but because she made the discipline behind it look necessary. "She used to say that your training is only as good as your judgment," the coach said. Because technique without judgment is just violence with extra steps. These testimonies, and others like them, filtered into the public understanding of who Renee Carter was and what the footage had actually shown, and they shifted something in the tone of how people were talking about the incident from the flat transactionalism of an incident report to something that felt, slowly and unevenly, like genuine reckoning. Veterans organizations issued statements. Advocacy groups cited the incident in the context of broader conversations about racial bias in public security and the gap between policy and practice in retail loss prevention. Legal scholars noted that Renee's case illustrated, with unusual clarity, the principle that a person has the right to defend themselves from unlawful force even in the context of a detention, and that the guard's decision to apply force before police arrived and without proper cause had exposed Westgate to considerable liability. Sims and Fenn had multiple conversations in the week, following the incident that were long and uncomfortable, and resulted in a commitment to a comprehensive review of security protocols and hiring standards, not because they had suddenly developed moral clarity, but because the footage had been seen by too many people for anything less than a thorough response to be credible. Westgate held the formal apology event 1 week after the incident, in the main atrium, at a small podium that had been set up near the information desk. It was not a large production. Fenn had been advised against anything that looked like it was trying too hard, and Patricia Sims had been clear that the event needed to be substantive rather than performative. Approximately 200 people attended, including several of Renee's former unit members, who had rearranged their schedules to be there, and who stood in a loose group near the back, with the particular quiet solidarity of people who have been in difficult places together. The guard who had first applied force made a statement of apology that was brief and appeared to be sincere. Davis made a similar statement. Fenn spoke about the changes to the security training program, a new mandatory curriculum developed in consultation with a de-escalation specialist and a civil rights attorney, specific protocols for detaining individuals that built in waiting periods and required supervisory review before any physical intervention, and quarterly bias training for all mall security personnel. He acknowledged that these changes should have been in place already. He said it was not enough that they were being implemented now, but that they were necessary and they would happen. Then he introduced Renee. She walked to the podium from the side of the atrium where she had been standing with her mother, who had driven 3 hours to be there, who was wearing the burgundy scarf that Renee had eventually purchased before leaving the mall on the day of the incident, and who had the contained, watchful expression of a woman who raised a daughter to handle hard things with grace and is proud of what that produced. Renee stood at the podium and looked out at the 200 people in front of her and took a breath. She had written notes, and she folded them in her pocket without looking at them. "I want to start by saying something that might be unexpected," she said. "I am not angry." She paused and let that sit for a moment. "I was, for a while. I think that's allowed. But anger that isn't disciplined doesn't produce anything useful. And discipline is something I understand." She looked at the guards who had applied force to her the week before. "I don't believe those men are bad people. I believe they made serious mistakes. I believe those mistakes came from bias they may not have fully recognized in themselves and from training that didn't give them the tools to do better. And I believe because I have to believe this, because it's the only thing that makes any of this worth talking about, that people can be taught to do better." She looked at the wider crowd. "What I experienced last week was not unique to me. It happens constantly, in malls and stores and streets and hospitals and offices, to people who don't have 11 years of military training and a documented record to produce when the camera footage gets pulled. It happens to people who don't know how to stay calm when someone is applying illegal force to them. It happens to people who do fight back and who pay a much higher price for it than I did. Those are the people I'm thinking about. That's why I agreed to be here today." She placed both hands on the edge of the podium. "The training changes that Mr. Fenn described are a start. I hope they become a standard. I hope every institution that employs people with authority over other people makes the investment in teaching those people to see clearly, to slow down, to check their assumptions before they act on them. Because the cost of getting it wrong, as last week demonstrated, is very high. For everyone." She stopped there, looked once at her mother, and stepped back from the podium. The atrium was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then someone in the back began to clap, and the sound built quickly into something full-throated and sustained. The kind of applause that isn't about performance but about recognition. The sound people make when something true has been said in a room where truth has been in short supply. Renee stood at the side of the atrium and received it with the same composure she had maintained throughout, nodding once, her hands at her sides. Afterward, she and her mother walked out of Westgate Premier Shopping Center, side by side, into the afternoon light. Her mother had looped her arm through Renee's, and the burgundy scarf was bright at her throat. They walked at the same unhurried pace Renee used for everything efficient, deliberate, fully present. The people who passed them in the parking lot saw a tall woman in an olive jacket and a shorter woman in a scarf, walking together toward a car, talking quietly. No one stared. No one pointed. The particular weight that had pressed against Renee in that space for the past 7 days had lifted. Not entirely, but enough to breathe in. She opened the passenger door for her mother, walked around to the driver's side, and got in. She sat for a moment without starting the engine. Her mother looked at her. Renee said, "I still need to find a watch." Her mother laughed, the kind of laugh that releases something, and Renee smiled and started the car and drove them both home. What remained was not the drama of the incident, but the quieter evidence of what Renee Carter had always been, a person of extraordinary capability who chose, in the moment when capability was most available to her, to exercise restraint, who could have hurt people and chose not to, who could have been destroyed by what happened to her, by the humiliation, by the presumption, by the weight of being wrong in a crowd of strangers, and chose instead to turn it towards something useful. That choice, that discipline, was not incidental to who she was. It was the whole point of everything she had trained for. Not the ability to fight, but the ability to choose not to. Not the power to dominate, but the wisdom to know when enough is enough. The cameras had captured her technique, but what they could not fully capture, what no footage can fully capture, was the thing that governed the technique, a moral clarity that had been forged in service and honed through years of deciding, again and again, what kind of person she wanted to be in the hardest moments. That clarity did not make her invulnerable to what the world sometimes did to people who looked like her, but it made her, always, the most complete person in the room. And on that afternoon, as her car pulled out of the Westgate parking lot and turned toward the highway, that was more than enough. The week after the formal apology, Renee received a letter handwritten, on plain stationery from a woman she did not know. The woman identified herself only as someone who had been standing near the boutique that afternoon, and who had, in her own words, said nothing when she should have spoken up. She wrote that she had watched everything happen and had thought, in the first 30 seconds, that she understood what she was seeing, and had not questioned that understanding until the atrium screen showed her what the cameras had actually captured. She wrote that she had been thinking about that gap between what she'd assumed and what was true every day since. She wrote that she didn't expect forgiveness and wasn't asking for it. She just wanted Renee to know that one person in that crowd had gone home changed. Renee read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer of her desk where she kept things that mattered. She did not write back. She thought that what the woman had written was enough, not the apology, but the honesty of it. The willingness to sit with the discomfort of having been wrong and to name it clearly, rather than explaining it away. That, she thought, was the beginning of something, not a solution, not an ending, but a beginning, which is always where everything worthwhile starts. There were people in Renee Carter's life who had tried, over the years, to draw out the stories she carried, the deployments, the training, the championship, the commendations. She gave those stories sparingly, and only to people she trusted completely. Not because she was ashamed of them, but because she had come to understand that when people learn what you're capable of, they stop seeing what you actually are. She would rather be underestimated than misread. She would rather be invisible than iconic, and she had done a very good job of both. Right up until the afternoon that 3 men in Navy uniforms decided, in the space of 8 seconds, to find out what happened when you pushed her past the point where staying still was no longer an option.